All right, so just in closing, let's tackle the legalization of active euthanasia and arguments against it. Right? Because regardless of how the debate that we've already identified, the passive versus active euthanasia, allowing harm versus physically doing harm, let us pretend for a moment that in this argument Rachel's is correct, and that active euthanasia is, in fact, morally permissible. Some may still argue that even if this were true, it doesn't really matter, for ultimately active euthanasia should remain illegal because its legalization would lead to bad consequences. I have a couple here that I've identified, and let's talk a little bit about each of these. So first, one bad consequence of active euthanasia becoming legal is the erosion of the doctor-patient trust. Patients need to be able to visit their doctors knowing that the doctor will not kill them. If patients know that euthanasia is legal, they may fear being put down against their will, and this erosion of trust would be disastrous. Think of those who opposed putting organ donor on your driver's license for fear that doctors would intentionally allow patients with donor cards to die in order to obtain their organs. I don't think they do this, but that fear still exists. A second bad consequence could be the demand to justify the continuation of life. Right now, continuing to live is the default position. If someone wants to seek treatment for their condition or does not want to be removed from life support, no one questions this choice. Death is not a legally sanctioned option. But if death is an option, patients may feel some pressure to have to justify their continued existence. This pressure may lead to many patients feeling guilty or incapable of explaining their continued will to live, and therefore be indirectly coerced into euthanasia. Number 3 is the slippery slope. Even if we restrict euthanasia to clear out cases, such as the patient with the terminal disease who is suffering from agonizing, unrelievable pain, there is still a slippery slope. What begins as voluntary active euthanasia in just extreme cases may eventually slide easily into voluntary active euthanasia in less extreme cases, and then into non-voluntary, as in, like, say, the patient is in a coma and cannot consent, active euthanasia, and ultimately into involuntary, i.e., patient is conscious but has not consented, active euthanasia. Involuntary euthanasia may begin with the appearance of consent. Grandparents in a nursing home or a currently healthy patient diagnosed with cancer being subtly pressured into euthanasia because their continued care or treatment is too expensive. And we could probably think of a couple other of ways that that type of pressure could be applied. We can imagine someone saying, "Oh, Grandma, at this rate, in a couple of months, you'll have no inheritance to leave for your children. Then we'll be footing the bill. I guess they said euthanasia was an option, but don't worry. We'll figure out how to pay for all of this. Euthanasia is not an option as far as we're concerned." Wink, wink. But Grandma may feel pressured into concluding that it is an option, maybe the only option. But even worse, we may even someday euthanize the elderly or the sick completely against their will. There's a movie called Logan's Run that does just this. It's an old cheesy sci-fi flick, but maybe you like it. Now, are these legitimate worries? Take a moment to think about it. Are these legitimate worries? Why or why not? Now, finally, here are 2 more worries about the permissibility of active euthanasia. First, valid consent. Presumably, even if killing a patient is morally permissible, it is only permissible if the patient gives their informed consent. But is it even possible for someone who is suffering from a terminal illness to give valid consent to being killed? Such a patient may not be able to think clearly or fully realize the repercussions of what they are asking for. Furthermore, when the alternative to dying is excruciating pain, there do not seem to be any reasonable alternatives to death. As such, their request for death may, in some sense, be coerced or forced upon them by their desire to make the pain stop. And fifth, inalienable rights. Many think that we have a right to life, and that any life is inalienable. That is, even if we want to forfeit that right, any attempt to do so is automatically invalid. Consider the right to liberty, for instance. If someone wants to forfeit this right by selling herself into slavery, may she do so? Some say no, claiming that the right to liberty is simply not one that any individual is capable of forfeiting. Is the right to life also something like that? Certainly some food for thought.